As Cindy said, my name is Jake Hendee. I'm the arborist here at Smithsonian Gardens, managing all of the trees at our gardens and museums around the National Mall, as well as other sites in DC and Maryland. My Let's Talk Gardens webinar today will, as Cindy said, be Pruning with a Purpose, a gardener's guide to thinking like an arborist. It's my goal that this is not a standard sort of beginning pruning how-to. Implicit in the title, we'll focus on one of the most common and sort of hopefully easily corrected mistakes that I see home gardeners, horticulturists, and even arborists make. We forget to define what our purpose is when we pick up the pruning tools. Rephrasing that, we just start cutting before we think about what we're doing. We'll also dig into quite a bit of background about how trees work and conversely, how we might expect them to respond to our pruning as well. So before I get started, I'd like to highlight a resource that we have available at si.gardenexplorer.org. At the Smithsonian, all of our trees are managed as an official Smithsonian collection. si.gardenexplorer.org maps and describes our living collection and provides an amazing database of images of fall, winter, spring, and summer images, as well as close-up photography of tree leaves, twigs, bark, fruit, flowers, and more for all of our living collection items. I'd especially like to highlight that many of our awesome images in this presentation are directly from si.gardenexplorer.org and taken by our talented living collections photographer, Hanale Latte. So first, before we get started, I'd like to gauge our audience just a little bit today with a poll. Do you consider yourself an entry-level gardener, a mid-level gardener, such as a new master gardener, an advanced level gardener, maybe a more experienced master gardener, or a green industry professional, such as a horticulturist, an arborist, or another green industry professional?
Okay, I have the poll up, Jake, and people are voting. I'm going to give it a couple seconds and let them voice or to vote or indicate what experience level that they have. I will end it in a couple seconds and then we'll share the results. But it looks like a lot of them are mid-level gardeners, new master gardeners. So that looks, but we do have some entry-level gardeners. We have at least one arborist and some other green professionals. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll so we can see. There you go. So perfect. The most is 38% are new master gardeners. So you'll be able to help with that.
That's what I was hoping we would find out there. So moving on to the next slide here, we've got three primary objectives for the talk today. First, a big focus of this talk will be about establishing a clear thought process to successful pruning, including having a clearly defined and well thought out purpose or objective to our pruning. Second, I hope to provide a narrative that helps us think more like an arborist, not just what to do, but why we are doing it, how the tree is going to respond, and how to look as far ahead into the future to accomplish the most with our pruning as possible. And third, I'll add several hopefully interesting short avenues for a little bit more in-depth thinking about trees and pruning, and I'll suggest some further resources related to these topics throughout the presentation as well. Our target audience today is mid-level to advanced level gardeners, so I'm glad to see what the results we got to that poll. But I think everybody from beginning and entry-level gardeners to professional horticulturists and arborists will take something home from this talk. Our focus today is trees, but many of these tools will be useful for managing your shrubs, your other woody plants as well, except palm trees. You may not find a lot to managing your palms if you're in a more tropical region. I recognize that very few, if any, of the audience will be climbing arborists, production arborists, tree care professionals. But I hope this will make us better at pruning during sort of those early formative years for our young trees and our shrubs. I'm also a firm believer that informed consumers get a much better product when working with production arborists, certified arborist tree care professionals, tree care contractors, whatever you want to call them. Anytime I talk about tree care work or pruning, safety comes first. Again, the focus of this talk is making our audience better pruners and more informed consumers of tree care contractor services. The purpose of this talk is not to teach nor encourage our audience to take on many of the risky tasks that production arborists and tree care professionals are trained and experienced with. If you find yourself questioning whether your pruning plans are potentially unsafe, hurt you or someone else, or create an unsafe condition in the tree, please hire a professional. There are plenty of cringeworthy examples of people on YouTube who did not heed this piece of advice. Again, I'll reemphasize that I think it's worth saying that I want you to be an informed consumer when working with tree care professionals. If you just hand off your tree to a professional and say, prune my tree and walk away, you're definitely not pruning with purpose. You should be very specific about what your goals are and be an advocate to ensure those goals are recognized when a professional is pruning your tree. So with all of that out of the way, here's an outline for today's webinar. First, I'll start by previewing the points that I want our audience to take home from the webinar. Second, we'll review the thought process that I'd encourage our audience to follow when thinking about pruning a tree. Third, I've put together some content about how trees work and how we can expect them to respond to our pruning. Fourth, we'll work through 2 to 3, probably just 2 basic pruning case studies. And then finally, I'll circle back to review those same concluding take-home points that we start the presentation with. At which point, Cindy will cut my mic and we'll listen to your questions. So my first of 3 take-home points is again, without a clearly defined purpose to cutting branches, pruning is just haphazardly inflicting injuries to a tree. Every pruning cut is an injury to the tree, so we should use them very wisely. The photo here on this slide is a pretty devastating case of tree decay caused solely by a pruning cut. The manager of this tree didn't learn the first time. They made the same mistake right above the first mistake several years later. This cut up here will also develop into another decayed hollow like this thing. Not a good thing. My second take-home point is understanding basic tree shrub physiology is critical to good pruning. I put the emphasis on basic because this isn't rocket science. It's just a few key principles to remember. Highlighted 3 of them here. Decay. Large and damaging cuts will foreseeably result in situations like this, where you can see right through the tree, or worse. Tree health. Ailing trees don't respond well to pruning. And pruning ailing trees generally isn't going to make them any healthier. And then understanding plant hormones and bud dormancy. There's a relatively simple plant hormone pathway that controls new tree growth or the lack thereof. And understanding that will avoid unexpected pruning responses, such as this sort of chaotic mess of growth that occurred on this apple tree after it was chopped to bits. And then my third and final take-home point is I want to emphasize that pruning should be a proactive long-term strategy, not a reactive single event. Here are 2 Princeton American elms that are about 10 years apart in age, very similar in architecture. On the larger tree back here, the branch I've circled is a branch that we don't want on the tree for reasons we'll discuss later, but we can't really tactfully remove it now without taking half the tree off. You can see on the smaller tree, we've had the foresight to proactively remove a branch with very similar characteristics to prevent future problems with this tree, similar to the older one in the background. So let's start with an unpruned tree. Here's one on our campus, right across the street from the Washington Monument. What's the best thought process to get it pruned well? Here's 8 steps that I've put together. This is nothing you're going to see in an industry standard or a pruning manual. It's just my thoughts on the process to get it done best. First, know and identify your tree. Step 2, put the pruners down. You're not ready to prune yet. Step 3, assess your tree's health. Step 4, assess the site as it relates to your tree. Step 5, be patient. Keep those pruners down. You've got more work to do. Step 6, most importantly, and again, the focus of this presentation, define a purpose or an objective for cutting branches. What do you want to accomplish by cutting branches off the tree? Step 7, look toward the future. What can you expect? What do you foresee the tree will do in the future? And how can you prune to manage that? And then step 8, go ahead and start cutting branches. So first, know and identify your tree. While we could spend days researching every last facet about the complement of trees in our gardens, a good hour of research is probably about the most it would take to tell us as much as we need to know to do a good job pruning our trees. Identify our trees, make records, sketch a map. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or official. figure out the habitat that they like to grow in nature, and learn a little bit about how they grow. Again, all things that are available online. Identifying our trees, social media, other internet resources are a great place to get a tree identification. A lot of good Facebook groups with a lot of enthusiastic tree identifiers. Just, of course, be careful. Not everything you read on the internet is true. And then as highlighted earlier, our si.gardenexplorer.org and similar sites from other public and botanical gardens provide a wealth of tree ID information. Here's this pin oak. We've got 57 digitized images of this pin oak that you could compare to a tree you think maybe a pin oak in your front yard. And then now that we know what our tree is, do a little bit of research about where it likes to grow in nature. Its soils, moisture, sunshade tolerances, what USDA zone does it succeed in? Is the tree known as an adaptable generalist, or is it known as a finicky specialist with a narrow range? For many hybrids and cultivated selections, you may have to make some deductions based upon where the parent tree species likes to grow in nature. One really common mistake I see here in the DC region is dogwood trees planted in hot, dry, sunny landscapes. Here's not the best picture of a dogwood on the landscape. As a tree adapted to moist, fertile soils in partially shaded forest understory habitat, a dogwood like this in hot, dry, sunny landscapes often look like this dogwood with sun-scorched leaves that are indicative of poor health and not a very resilient tree. Two factors that I really pay attention to in pruning is growth rate here on the y-axis and decay resistance as displayed here on the x-axis. I use the University of Florida tree fact sheets, great resource to find growth rates of several common trees, and wooddatabase.com to understand a few species' ability to resist decay. We can fairly aggressively prune a crepe myrtle up here at the top right because it's fast growing and resistant to decay. It's a vigorous tree. But I would go much more slowly on a Japanese maple that is neither fast growing nor is resistant to decay. For a fast growing large tree that is prone to decay, I would watch it very closely if I hired a professional to prune a silver maple hanging over my house. So that just gives you some of the, for those two characteristics, some of the different considerations. Now that you know your tree, you're not ready to prune yet, relax, put the pruners down, and we'll look at how your tree will respond to pruning. A lot of that is based upon, is the tree healthy? Is it well adapted to the site it's on? There's a common misconception that pruning improves tree health because it creates a growth response. If we define tree health as the tree's ability to stay alive and convert sun, water, and carbon dioxide to sugars, pruning rarely helps tree health. That growth response from pruning an unhealthy tree is just the tree spending its last carbohydrates, its last sugars, recovering from pruning because of some plant hormone confusion. If your tree looks like this tree to the right, not very good, prune off these dead branches and walk away. Step 3, assessing tree health doesn't take much more than common sense. Trust yourself. You know more than you think. Are the leaves a deep green? Is the foliage dense? Is the annual twig growth good? Most deciduous trees have a circular terminal bud scar around the branch that you can use to identify the beginning of each year's growth. This American beech only grew an inch or two in the year prior to this photo, showing it's struggling. Are the tips of the tree dying back? Is the tree physically damaged? Of the two trees here at the bottom, and I'll move forward to the poll, from our audience's perspective, which one do we think is healthier? Again, we can trust ourselves and take a guess. Which tree here looks healthier? And Cindy will give the group 10 or 15 seconds, and we'll see what our audience assesses. I should say these trees are planted on the same day, grown in the same row of the nursery, and just across a sidewalk from each other. So we can go ahead and wrap that up, Cindy, and show us our results.
Jake, we have some pretty smart attendees.
All right. So again, as I emphasized, use your common sense, and if a tree looks like it's doing well, it probably is pretty healthy. So the dense canopy of the tree on the right, it's got a little bit of fall color on it, so you can't see that deep green that you'd like to see on it, but that's just fall color when these photos were taken. Again, despite being the same age, you can see the tree at the right has put on quite a bit more diameter growth on the stem as well. So again, if your tree is healthy, then it's going to respond really well to pruning and needs to be pruned. So I'll take a moment here to highlight the most common tree health issue I see, which starts at the root flare of the tree, the transition between the roots of the tree and the shoot of the tree. So we have a tree health epidemic that really lies just below our soil lines. As a result of deep planting, too deep of mulching, you may have heard it called volcano mulching, and some practices that occur in our tree nurseries. A huge number of our trees that we plant look like the row of trees here at the right that was taken in the DC region. Dieback in the top of each of these trees, the whole row, because they were all treated the same way, has been caused by roots wrapped around the base of the tree down here that slowly cuts off the vascular system of the tree. If you look at the ground level, you can see that these trees are planted too deeply and mulched too deeply. You cannot see a root flare at all. If you can't see a clear widening or flare around the base of the tree that comes out of the ground like a smokestack, then you probably have an existing or future tree health problem on your hands. A number of studies have indicated more than 90% of our landscape trees are incorrectly planted, leading to tree health problems, drastically shortened lives, and many other problems. So if you're interested in that, I would strongly encourage looking at these two resources below, as well as many other resources that exist about stem girdling roots. Step 4, assess your site. If your tree is healthy and common sense tells you it should be happy in its site, then you're probably going to be pretty good to prune away. If your gut tells you that maybe the tree isn't as happy in its site, then maybe back off your ambitious pruning plans. Again, trust yourself. Use common sense when assessing moisture, soils, and light that the site provides to the tree. If the tree is in a low area, is it a tree that likes a lot of moisture? Conversely, if it's in an elevated area, does it like it dry? One of my favorite soil assessment methods is the 80s shag carpet versus the office carpet method. If your soil feels like walking around soft shag carpet, then it will probably grow a number of trees pretty well. If it's compacted down like office carpet would feel, only trees known as adaptable urban tolerant trees are probably going to be happy in that soil. And finally, light. Trees have a wide range of light preferences that you can research and easily assess just by looking at their view of the southern sky. Sometimes you have to think a little bit outside the box. One of my favorite examples of site assessment is these bald cypresses here on the National Mall, probably about 150-year-old trees. The trees are native to southern swamps, where you may be most familiar with them because of their knees that poke out of open waters, kind of like this submersed tree that we had in our wetland over at the American Indian Museum. Compare this tree that's submersed in water to the trees at the right, where heavily compacted soils on the National Mall actually provide a very similar environment to a southern swamp. Anaerobic, low oxygen soils that really retain moisture pretty well have allowed these trees to thrive for 150 years on the National Mall and otherwise really, really tough conditions for an urban tree. Back to our case of the silver bells here. On a similar note, here's an example of the silver bell trees I referenced earlier, planted on the same day from the same row in the nursery, but very different outcomes. Tree on the right being very healthy, the tree on the left really struggling. Silver bell trees have a reputation for being a bit more sensitive than most trees. They prefer rich, moist, fluffy, highly organic soils that drain pretty well. The soils in this area were damaged by compaction during a construction project. On one side of the sidewalk, our site horticulturist incorporated loads of compost, peat, moss, and pine fines into this garden bed. So if you walked across this soil, it would feel a lot more like soft shag carpet. On the other side, no soil amendments. So walking across this soil would feel a lot more like office carpet, pretty hard, nasty soil. Of course, you can see the outcomes. So why does site assessment and tree health matter? The tree on the right would respond really well to pruning. It needs to be pruned. The tree on the left will just die if we prune it much in its current condition. So that brings us to step 5. So you know your trees, you know your tree's health, you know how it feels about its site, but it's still not time to prune. If the tree is unhealthy, fix its health before thinking about pruning off any more than dead branches or very small branches. Again, fix its mulch, knock down those mulch volcanoes, push that mulch out, push the mulch out as wide as you can get it, but don't pile it up around the base of the tree. Very carefully fix any roots that may be circling around the base of the tree, or find a way to conscientiously incorporate soil amendments. So here's our silver bell trees again, and this photo shows us using a high pressure air tool to break up that compacted soil and replace some of that damaged compacted soil with organic matter. You might irrigate more for trees that like moisture, or reduce irrigation for trees that don't like that moisture, et cetera, et cetera. Again, just to highlight the earlier point that I made, the vast majority of unhealthy trees that I see are a result of problems at the root flare. Too deep of planting, too deep of mulching, and the resulting circling and girdling roots that we discussed earlier. But if your tree is healthy, if it really looks like it's enjoying its site, it's got that dense green foliage, its annual growth looks good, then you're ready to really start thinking about everything you can do with pruning. Which gets to the main point of our presentation, step 6. Define a purpose or objective to why you want to cut branches. The point here is there is no one way, there's no one right way to prune. I'll pause to repeat that. There is no one way to prune. It depends on why you own the tree, where it is, and what you want to get out of it. So this flowering, mature saucer magnolia in our Haupt garden, we just want to keep it looking nice. This American holly in our landscape at the American Indian Museum, we just want it to look natural, not much pruning needed. This mature willow oak tree over a playground, we want to keep the area around it safe. Dutch elm disease, you can see the dieback caused by Dutch elm disease in this elm tree. This is one situation where pruning out this diseased part of the tree might actually save the tree and save its tree health. This crabapple hedge at our Hirshhorn Museum, we want to maintain its topiary hedge form as a designed landscape element. All very different pruning objectives for cutting branches. There are a huge number of pruning objectives you can choose one or more of to maintain your tree, depending on what you want the tree, where it is, how it fits into your garden design, all those sorts of considerations. Here's a long list of potential pruning objectives from our tree care industry standard. It's really important to say that not all are appropriate for every tree, and some are particularly problematic. So proceed conscientiously, do your research, but most importantly, figure out what it is that you want to accomplish with your pruning. As an arborist, my favorite objective to talk about is improving tree structure. One of our biggest loss of urban trees is not diseases, development and deforestation, or some other factor out of control. It is trees that develop defects that one, cause them to fail during storms or high winds, or two, cause us to remove them because we want to keep the area, the urban area around them safe. Decades of research and practice have taught us exactly the characteristics of trees that remain strong and long-lived versus those that need to be removed from our landscape. We know the characteristics of strong trees. A single main stem with well-spaced, well-attached, and appropriately sized secondary branches, a good root flare, as I mentioned earlier, a large live crown ratio, and a balanced crown, among many factors. So what's the obvious solution? Just prune trees to have those characteristics. In my opinion, we should be doing this for the vast majority of our trees, but we're not. It's just such an obvious solution that we need to be doing more of. Here's an example of structural pruning on our campus. How can we prune this tree here at the right to improve its structure, to make it a strong, safer, and more long-lived tree? how do we grow another 100 to 200-year-old tree where several other iconic trees stand at our National Museum of Natural History? In this example, first we looked at the temporary branches on the tree. These are the branches that the tree needs when it's young, but we want to remove them before they become too big to remove. Here in yellow, you can see we removed the lowest 2 branches, and then this third one up here, we didn't remove it, but we significantly slowed it down and de-emphasized it, got it ready for removal in the future by just reducing its tip back. Second, as you can see up here with these blue lines where previous branches were, we want to favor the main leader of the tree or the main stem, because we know a tree with a single main stem as the strongest structure. So here in the blue, we significantly reduced back the high number of competing main stems to favor this one main stem in the middle. Third, we looked at other characteristics such as branch attachments, branch angles, branch sizes, and distribution of branches. Next time we prune, we will address the fact that multiple of our main scaffold branches emerge from this one point on the tree and compete for space to attach to the trunk here. We'll remove a couple of these in the future. It's a process. We will return every 2 to 5 years to encourage the strongest, most resilient tree possible. Pruning is a process. One of the things that I love about my job is that I manage the same 2,000 trees, and I can return frequently to provide what the trees need in light doses, rather than being put in the hopeless situation that many arborists are put in of having one chance to prune a tree to its best form. Here's a tree that we completed a little bit of light structural pruning on. Most of the branches down here below the arrow are just temporary branches that we don't want on the tree when it's mature. They're too low and it's next to a street and a sidewalk. We planned for the future here by just keeping those temporary branches relatively small compared to the main trunk and the permanent canopy by just making cuts out here to reduce those tips back, slow the branches down, and get them ready for removal once this permanent canopy up here develops and can support the tree. And finally, after 20 minutes of talking about pruning, we arrive at actually picking up the pruners and pruning the tree. I'm not going to go into pruning basics. That's not the point of this presentation. There are a huge number of publications, YouTube videos, and websites about how to do basic pruning. I've listed a few great resources here at the bottom of the page, but a few highlights. Be safe, make good, clean cuts that heal quickly, respect the branch collar where the branch attaches to the tree, and use the right tools that are sharp and well maintained. A favorite pruning tool of mine is this pole pruner in use here, which allows us to steward our trees through the most important first 10 to 15 formative years of their life without our feet ever leaving the ground. As for how to prune, remember that every pruning cut is an injury to the tree, but it may very well be a worthwhile injury to the tree. In general, remove as little foliage as possible, remove as little leaf area of the tree as possible, and minimize the size of your cuts. However, a large cut today may prevent a larger cut on the tree tomorrow. So here's a tree that we let get a little bit out of control with lower branching here off to the left that wasn't really consistent with our long-term objective for the tree. To fix that, we took a pretty large cut. So before on the left, after on the right. So to fix that, we took a larger cut than ideal, but that branch was only going to become larger, more aesthetically, and also structurally problematic with time. Of course, that underscores the need to stay ahead of pruning and proactively plan for the future to avoid situations like this in general. So now that we've worked our way through that basic thought process about pruning, I'd like to highlight a few more in-depth points of emphasis that we'll expand on in the next slides. Paying attention to the buds of the tree, pruning for structure and not for health, keeping cuts small and minimizing foliage removal, looking to the future, and not forgetting to pick a pruning system, an appropriate pruning system as well. So I'll spend several slides on the buds here. Paying attention to the buds. What is a bud? A bud is a structure on the tree. It may be easily visible or not, that has the potential to develop into a new flower, leaf, and or branch. On the left here is a flowering cherry with its buds expanding into bloom and leaf. Each of these here is a bud. Here's a couple buds, 1 and 2, where you find a lot of buds right under where the leaf on a deciduous tree is attached to the branch. Conifers, so this pine and this juniper, are a little bit more confusing. The tips of the juniper here have small, almost imperceptible buds on them. And then the candles at the tips of pine trees that you may be familiar with are the buds of pine trees as well. So why are buds important? Why are we talking about them? Without a bud, there is no growth. If you cut off all the buds, you kill that branch, or in some cases I've seen you kill the entire tree. You'll see buds in 3 different places that behave very, very differently. So we'll dig into the technical just a tiny bit here. First, you have your terminal buds, so the tips of each growing branch. These buds expand upward and outward to provide height and width growth, so 1 and 2. You have your lateral buds, so most often found where the leaf of a deciduous tree is attached to the branch. These mostly stay dormant or inactive unless they get a signal such as light or plant hormones to expand into a new branch. So lateral buds here, 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 here. An especially common mistake with conifers like this pine is to cut the growing buds off entirely back to where you might expect some buds to be. But if you look at this photo, right at the base of the needles where you might expect to see buds, lateral buds specifically, there are no buds. So no buds, no growth. So if we cut the tips of this branch off, then this branch is going to slowly die. Then the third type of bud is latent buds, and those are hidden buds that trees hide in spots you don't expect maybe to see them, like under thick bark on the lower stem, or even at the base of the tree. These buds pop up and surprise you, like when we pruned off the lower branches of this elm tree. All of these little sprouts that came up are the result of hidden latent buds that we probably didn't see when we were pruning the tree. As soon as this part of the tree got new light, those buds burst into growth. So now that we know the types of buds, we can talk just a little bit, a couple slides here about plant hormone pathways. And these are really, really important to the remainder of our talk. Plant growth is a battle between, primarily between 2 plant hormones, auxins and cytokinins. Auxins are produced up here and here in the terminal buds. They suppress canopy growth, they stimulate root growth, and they counteract the effects of the cytokinins that are moving up from below. The cytokinins are produced in the root tips, and they suppress root growth, stimulate canopy growth, and counteract the effects of the auxins that are produced out here at the branch tips. Now, because auxin is produced in the terminal buds out here and here, it suppresses the growth of all of these lateral buds on the main stem, here, 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 and here. So those stay inactive. If we were to remove the terminal buds, each of these lateral buds would burst forth into growth. If we were to keep one or both of these tips, then the growth would be a lot more controlled. There are, of course, major pruning implications. So again, auxins up here produced in the tips discourage growth from below. Cytokinins produced down in the roots, and as they move up the tree, they encourage growth, but are suppressed by the auxins from the tips. So we'll use a couple pruning examples to really develop that point. The nursery industry, how nurserymen use auxins and cytokinins to produce trees that you and I want to buy. Most trees start from seeds or cuttings of relatively unbranched trees, over here known as whips. If we cut off the terminal bud, so the top bud in the nursery, the second photo here, that removes the primary source of auxin production and allows those cytokinins from the roots to encourage lateral bud and lateral branch growth, as you can see start to develop here in the third photo. So the initial cut was here, and then these lateral branches all developed below that cut. Eventually, those lateral branches develop terminal buds, tip buds of their own that produce auxin and discourage further branching and growth below them. As you can see in the fourth photo, nurseries will again prune off those tips up and down the tree to encourage the development of a dense canopy on the tree, encourage the growth of those inner buds to fill up that tree. And finally, photo 5, not the greatest photo, but you can see us installing a tree that we purchased from the nursery that has that thick, dense, symmetrical, and pyramidal canopy from this style of pruning. It works really well in the nursery. They really capture those two plant hormones well to produce a nice product, but it really isn't how we would plan to manage most trees on the landscape. Another example that speaks to the role of plant hormones and buds and the shapes and the forms of trees. On the left, you can see a mixed hedge in a residential neighborhood here in the DC area that appears to create a privacy screen along this sidewalk and busy street from someone's backyard. On the right, you can see the natural form of each of the 5 visible components of the hedge: arborvitaes, cryptomerias, southern magnolias, crepe myrtles, and a yew. By repeatedly shearing off all of the terminal buds, the tip buds, the branch tips, the owners of this hedge have encouraged those lateral buds to grow in from behind, from the interior of the tree, and create a dense screen of vegetation between their backyard and a heavily traveled thoroughfare. Again, they very well accomplished that objective. It's a labor-intensive maintenance strategy, but also an effective way to keep branches out of the sidewalk and street, probably another of their pruning objectives. This is the same concept by which many of us maintain various hedges. Remove the terminal buds at the branch tips, remove the auxin source that suppresses the thickening of the growth and the growth of the lateral buds, and allow those cytokinins to push more growth out through the lateral buds and create a dense plane of vegetation at the periphery of the plant. One more useful application of thinking about plant hormone signals and plant buds is directional pruning. So directional pruning is a quite useful tool that can be used or abused, as it has been here, to direct growth away from where we don't want growth and direct growth toward where we do want it. Here it has been used to direct growth away from some high tension power lines that are running right through the middle of the tree. That's a good thing. But it also created quite an ugly and probably unsafe V-shaped tree, both bad outcomes of directional pruning. More often you might think of using this to direct growth away from a building or maybe out of a walkway or garden pathway, or just redirect growth to fill up a gap in the canopy of a tree that you have. The idea of directional pruning is simple. Remove a branch growing in an undesirable direction back to another branch another branch or another bud that's pointed in a better direction. So over here, your first choice would be to prune back. If you don't like this branch growing straight out, you could prune it back to a secondary branch that is pointed to the right. This terminal bud out here is producing auxin, so it would discourage sort of messy, uncontrolled growth below. Your second choice would be to cut back to a bud pointing in a more desirable direction that you want your new growth to grow in. By clipping off the terminal bud out here, you remove those suppressive auxins and those cytokinins flow from the roots and encourage this bud and all the others to grow in their respective directions. You get less control, but you have influenced the directional growth of the tip of this branch from straight ahead to slightly to the left, which could be very helpful. Which brings us to bud dormancy. Could write an entire presentation about this, but knowing when buds will break dormancy or when they will transition from inactive to active versus when they will stay inactive is very helpful to good pruning. There are 3 primary causes of bud dormancy: temporary unfavorable environmental conditions, factors called eco-dormancy, such as shade or temporarily cold temperatures, factors inside the plant but outside the bud, such as structural change, or it's called paradormancy, and that's plant hormones such as auxins and cytokinins. And then you'll also see dormancy that is a result of structural changes to the tree, particularly as it enters and exits winter. This is called endodormancy. I'll cut this short by stating the more that you can incorporate the reason for inactivity and activity of buds into your pruning, the better you're going to be able to predict and understand the tree's response. We're going to transition away from plant buds and dormancy now. For the next much shorter point is prune for structure, not for health. Pruning is primarily a tool that alters tree structure for our goals and our objectives. It may cause a vigorous growth response that some perceive to be an increase in plant health as a result of sort of those short-term plant hormonal cues. But that growth response is not indicative of positive long-term health nor carbohydrate balance. When an obviously stressed tree like this shows aggressive and chaotic growth response, all these succulent shoots coming up, there's a good chance it's expending its last carbohydrate reserves on growth because of plant hormone confusion created by bad pruning, not because it's a healthier tree. Next, keeping cuts small and minimizing foliage removal. As anyone who has ever owned a wooden deck or a wooden fence can attest, wood decays. This is particularly true for interior heartwood on a tree, and less so for the live cells and the sapwood of the tree on the exterior of the tree. By minimizing the size of your cuts, you minimize the chance of decay resulting in things like hollow trees, see-through trees, this hazardous situation where a tiny shell of solid wood is holding up a massive tree, or tree failures. The more you are able to look into the future to avoid larger cuts in the future, the better pruner you will become. Second part of this is the percent of foliage you remove. We all learned in elementary school biology that tree leaves convert solar energy or sun, water, and carbon dioxide into sugars for plant growth and consequently plant health. The more foliage and leaf area a tree has, the more sugar it is going to be able to produce. The more sugar the tree is able to produce, the more vigorous and resilient it is going to be. You can see this in the landscape or in nature by comparing the growth rate and health of trees that are suppressed, crowded, and shaded forest conditions, such as this grove at our American Indian Museum, to a tree with a lot of space and light, such as this tree at the right, the spignut hickory, also of the same age and same species at our American Indian Museum. The tree at the right is much happier and much healthier. We want to remove as little foliage as possible to accomplish our goals, but we also want to acknowledge that a healthy tree has plenty of reserves when we need to remove more than usual during pruning. So we could prune this tree quite heavily, but these trees over here, they don't have a huge carbohydrate reserve, so we would want to go a little bit lighter on them and remove less foliage and less leaf area. The next key to successful pruning is to, as I've mentioned several times throughout the presentation, look to the future. Pruning with foresight is one of the best skills to be able to minimize the shocks to the tree, and it takes a little bit of practice. Here's the story of two patriot elms planted on the same day or on at least the same week. The tree on the left was pruned pretty well in the nursery for our objective of growing a tree with the strongest, longest lasting structure. Despite pruning it quite frequently, probably annually for the 2 to 3 years prior to this photo, small cuts and light pruning doses mean you can barely tell we've removed anything from it. The tree on the right was not pruned as very much in the nursery and not for our objective of growing a tree with the strongest structure. So we were required to do some pretty aggressive pruning to get it back on track. You can see the larger pruning cuts result in more of a choppy and less natural tree look, but we made the determination that it was an acceptable cost to bear now for better structure and a longer lasting tree in the future. And finally, the fifth key to successful pruning is to make sure that you pick a pruning system and pick an appropriate one at that. Most trees will be pruned to a natural pruning system that is characteristic of the form you would see them growing in nature. Most any tree can be maintained according to this system. The second most common pruning system is topiary pruning, which is generally shearing a tree or a shrub to a geometric shape, such as a hedge or a rounded structural element. This can be an effective strategy with the right tree for the right design, usually a more formal design, but I often see it overused, used in inappropriate situations, or used on the wrong trees. It's commonly seen on the landscape on things like hollies, arborvitaes, because they're slower growing trees that will cooperate better with this high maintenance pruning system, better than a fast growing tree or shrub. Finally, there are several specialty pruning systems, including espalier, pleaching, pollarding, fruit tree pruning, bonsai, and others that can be used for very specific horticultural objectives, but you don't commonly see most of those. So now I have a couple case studies that we'll work through. This is one of our iconic Japanese flowering cherries, the Yoshino cherry, planted on our landscape at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. As a case study, I'd like to think about this tree might be similar to a small or medium-sized flowering tree in a backyard or a back garden. One of the most beautiful things about a lot of smaller flowering trees is that they don't require a great deal of pruning to do their job really well. However, we still have objectives we can accomplish with pruning. We want these trees to appear tidy and well maintained. We want it to remain clear of the ground for lawnmowers and the sidewalk, and maybe somebody picnicking on the bench below. And we want it to be a strong tree that will last a long time and be safe for the public to be around. So we'll work our way through the steps of getting it pruned well. First, knowing our tree. It's a medium-sized spreading tree. It's flowering. It's known to be vigorous and at least somewhat resistant to decay. And it's adaptable, but it likes full sunlight and moist, well-drained soils. It's a garden cherry that we can't really find in the wild, but we know it's a complex hybrid of several cherry trees whose native habitat is Japanese and East Asian mountains and uplands that receive significantly more rain than we do here. Second, we're not quite ready to prune yet. Third, we want to assess the tree's health. All signs point to a healthy tree. You can't see it in the photos, but dense green foliage, good annual twig extension. The tree is not showing any signs of slowing down. Fourth, we want to assess the site. We know in this case, the sandy, well-drained soils are irrigated with plenty of moisture and the site gets good sunlight. Fifth, it's still not time to prune yet, but all of the information above points to the tree being healthy and resilient and a good candidate for quite a bit of pruning if it needs it. Sixth, again, most importantly, what's our purpose? What's our objective? Why do we want to cut branches? Well, we want to maintain a tidy, clean, aesthetic. We want to maintain clearance above the ground, and we want to have good structure to our tree to a certain extent. So here's how we might accomplish that. For the tidiness of the tree, we definitely don't want any dead branches on it. We might see some damaged, bent, broken branches, or we might see the adventitious succulent branches known as water sprouts, mostly on the interior of the tree. We might want to thin the canopy a little bit so it has more of a light, airy look to it. So selectively removing small branches through the canopy. For clearance, we could either remove these lower branches, which would be pretty drastic, or we could start to reduce them back and get the lowest tips out of the way to create as much clearance as possible. And then structure. We want to do a little bit of structural pruning to form this tree into the strongest tree that can resist high winds, heavy ice, tourists swinging off the branches, things like that. Seventh, we want to plan for the future. So from a clearance and structure perspective, again, we don't really like these lower two branches. They're too low. They're big branches that will cause a lot of damage when we remove them. They're only getting bigger, but they're also branches that make up a great deal of the foliage of the tree. So if we remove these whole branches now, these two lower branches here, the tree is going to look naked. But if we just reduce the amount of foliage selectively on the ends with reduction cuts out near the tips, so maybe back to here, something like that, that really slows that branch down, gets it out of the way, and gets it ready to be removed in a year or two after the tree has added more growth up here where we want it. As I mentioned earlier, we would probably also want to favor a single central leader and well-spaced, well-angled, well-attached branches. So by clipping back some of these competing main stems, we can probably make it a little bit stronger overall. It's just a medium-sized flowering tree, so we won't be as aggressive with structural pruning as we might be with a large shade tree. So there's a few of the many thoughts that go into which branches we cut and how we cut them. And as you can see, I've made small red marks here where I might prune this tree. So reducing back these lower branches, clipping back some of these competing tips, cleaning out the dead, the damaged and broken branches, some of those water sprouts, succulent branches on the inside of the tree, and walking away after probably 10 or 15 minutes, not very aggressive pruning. I'm going to skip through a couple of these case studies in the interest of time. And so that will take us back to our final take-home points. Again, take-home point number one, without a clearly defined purpose, pruning is just haphazardly inflicting injuries to the tree. So going back to this example of a silver maple, as we learned during the presentation, large pruning cuts are very likely to lead to decay, especially on a decay-prone tree like silver maple. If we make large risky cuts like this and this, it should only be done to accomplish a very worthwhile objective. I think where I took this photo, the cuts were made to prevent leaves from dropping into a neighbor's yard. I would hope we wouldn't view that as a reasonable objective to destroy the tree for. Again, I want to reemphasize that every pruning cut is an injury to the tree, so we should use them wisely. Take-home point number two, understanding basic tree shrub physiology is critical to good pruning. Decay, large and damaging cuts will foreseeably result in situations like this, where you can see right through the tree or worse. Tree health, ailing trees don't respond well to pruning, and pruning sick trees generally isn't going to make them healthier, with a few exceptions. Plant hormones and bud dormancy. Remember those auxins that are produced out at the tips and the exterior of the canopy and the terminal buds suppress that additional and often unwanted and uncontrolled growth. The cytokinins that are produced at the roots move up the tree and push growth, maybe where you want it, but maybe where you don't want that growth, as we saw with this sort of chaotic response from this tree. Manage that relationship accordingly when deciding where, what, and how much to cut. And then finally, take home point number three, pruning should be a long-term strategy, not a single event. Again, there are these two Princeton American elms that are 10 years apart in age, pretty similar in architecture. You can see the larger tree has that codominant stem, or that second main stem that's competing with the primary, the central leader, the main stem of the tree. That's a structural defect that makes the tree less strong, less resilient to damage, and probably less long-lasting on the landscape. At this size of tree, we can't really remove the problematic branch, but there are more expensive, sort of labor-intensive ways to manage a defect like that. But ideally, when that tree is much younger, such as this tree here that's 10 years younger, we see that defect start to develop, and during structural pruning, we have the foresight to remove a second competing leader that we know will become a structural defect for that tree. So by pruning as a proactive long-term strategy rather than a reactive single event, we can make our trees strongest, most resilient, and most long-lived with the fewest negative effects to health, structure, and aesthetic as well. So with that, I will wrap it up with this slide. I've highlighted a few of my favorite pruning resources. Some of these are introductory resources that are really comprehensive intro to pruning, how to make your pruning cuts, which branches to remove, things like that. and some of these are a little bit more extensive resources. A lot of this presentation is based upon this publication out of Purdue, Tree Pruning, What Do Trees Think? It's really a fun read. And finally, as highlighted earlier in the presentation, there are a lot of safety considerations to heed. Please hire a professional, be an informed consumer if your project involves risks to yourself, others around you, property, or the potential to create tree-related hazards, such as weak branches or something like that. So with that, I will turn it back over to Cindy, and we'll open it up for questions.
Wow, that was great, Jake. Thank you so much. As people in the attendees can see, this is a complicated subject, but not really. I like the way you say study it and don't bring your pruners. I always say bring your coffee cup out and assess the tree before you even touch the pruners. So I echo your sentiment and your suggestions totally. We are almost out of time, but I want attendees to know that we will be answering questions in our resource page that we post on our website, along with Jake's video after this is complete. It takes Jake a little while to answer the questions and then put them in. And some of the questions are so very specific, like for fruit trees or nandinas or whatever. There are some great books out there, but I always recommend cut minimally, which you have too, and then see what happens, because you're going to have to learn your trees. But I think the best one that everybody wants to know, when is the best time to prune?
Cindy, I almost included a slide on that. That's one of the most common questions that I get, and in many situations, probably the vast majority of situations, you are better to prune when it's convenient. Get that pruning done more so than really calibrating it to a particular month or week of the year. All of that being said, there are certain considerations with each species of tree. We have it with our elms that we only prune during the dormant season due to Dutch elm disease. So again, I would go back to some of my early slides about know your tree, do your research, see if there are any specific limitations. Know when it flowers. Don't cut off all the flower buds when they develop. But most importantly, make sure that pruning gets done more so than trying to get that perfect day of the year to get it done.
I totally agree. It's much easier to prune dead branches out when they're living branches that you can contrast them to. And it's always good to know what you're going to do to the tree when you cut it off. So
We
I greatly appreciate this. Any other words of wisdom before we close for the day?
We do a lot of just to follow up on that question. We do a lot of dormant season pruning when the tree leaves are off, because you can see the structure of the tree. And as you may have picked up during this presentation, structure of the tree is really a key factor in how long it is on the landscape and how happy it is on the landscape. So we're just entering a really good season to do pruning, but again, I would avoid constraining yourself with things that may not be as important as just getting it done.
I agree. Well, thank you so much. And please, attendees, realize we will answer your questions. We have a lot, and we will answer them, and we'll post them on our resource page on our website. We appreciate your questions. We appreciate your interest. And we hope to see you next week when Janet Draper will be back and talk more about design in the garden. Until next week, thanks to everyone. See you in the garden. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.